It is my honor to be here today. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing the other two panelists. And Kathryn Turman is the head of the Victim Services Division with the FBI, and I've had the privilege of working with Kathryn many years. I can't tell you how much I can thank the FBI for the amount of information and lessons learned and experience that they've shared with us in our country and with our international network. And last but certainly not least, and I am so looking forward to hearing your presentation, David, is David Schonfeld, who is the Director of National Center for School Crisis and Bereavemen. I was looking at Dr. Daniele, need to use these cheaters to be able to see. And so we know we're their last panel between you and lunch. Do not head down to Bill's Burgers without your little coupon, because you'll need that coupon to get that. And remember, it's 1 hour, so make sure we met with them yesterday, Mary Beth, make sure you either get burgers, mac and cheese, or a Cobb salad, so make sure you get that on your way out. Those of you that don't know me, I try and use humor a lot too, because if I don't have 2 good belly laughs a day, I haven't had a good day. So what I'm going to do is hopefully go to that. There's actually Sue 1 and Sue 2. Since I retired, I've really missed having an executive assistant. So Sue 2 is actually me as the new executive assistant. So if there's any critiques of the PowerPoints, I'm still learning, but I'm doing my best. I thought it was pretty good using the Irish colors here. So what I wanted to talk to you about is an opportunity, and I'm hoping share with you some of the work we're doing at the international level. There is a tremendous amount of expertise worldwide, and I just even listening this morning, what I've learned this morning, listening to the panelists this morning, Dr. Daniele, and all of the great information that's here, I'll be taking that back. And I should mention that Mary Fetchett and Kathryn Turman are also members of Invictum, of our international group. And how we started, and I'm not going to read the thing there because the next slide is really what do we do. So Invictum stands for International Network for Victims of Terrorism and Mass Violence. We're supporting them, and we are a group of trusted experts. So we've known each other for years, and we thought about it, and we said, here's some of the busiest people around here, and we've got so much experience and knowledge that we could be learning from each other. We're not an organization. We are not a nonprofit. We are a network. And we are that on purpose because there is no formal structure or legal entity. I did buy the .coms, the .orgs, and the rest of that for the acronym Invictum, but we're not there as a formal organization. We're there to bring together people who have an opportunity to share knowledge, experience, lessons learned. And I wrote down, just added this morning, really we're a door and access to expertise as well. And so we're built on, we all are trusted and respected colleagues, and that's a big piece, right? Because if you bring the right people together, you can move a lot of change. And so we share our expertise, we take it, and then what we do is try and look back at our own countries. What can we bring back to our own countries to affect change? So I thought in the short period of time I talk about an example of how we're pushing for change in Canada based on a lot of the learning, the expertise, and the knowledge that's out there internationally. And so I tried to look at, so how do we do this? Sounds simple, but we start with monthly phone calls. We have an hour-and-a-half phone call. We have about 30, I'll say, representatives representing a tremendous amount of countries that are out there. The first half hour is a presentation. And so, for example, and I'll get into the other slide, some of the examples of presentations that we have. By the way, I use freeconferencecall.com. Any of you aware of that? Because I work with a lot of NGOs, and they don't have any money to pay $100 a phone call. So freeconferencecall.com is what we use. The other thing we've done and we've started is having an annual symposium. And we've had 2 symposiums. I'll talk a little bit about that contact. One in Dublin in 2017 and one in Stockholm, Sweden in 2018. Next year we'll be in France. And so the other thing that we do is we're a responsive network. There is a tremendous amount of knowledge and access to expertise and lesson learns, not just from the people that are on there, but in the network, but also the doors that they have access to. So Mary Fetchett is a member, as I mentioned. So look at the expertise that Mary has access to. So for example, I'm going to mention the Ontario Provincial Police because I have some members from the OPP here as a direct result of their wanting to be here for working with their wellness and resiliency program with that, which is a major police service in our country, and bringing back that knowledge and expertise to them as well. So this is the kind of networking, and there is, again, how do you access and know what exists in your own country, let alone internationally, unless you start to develop these networks to exchange that information? So, oops. Okay, so let me talk specifically about the responsive piece. And again, I'm just going to use a couple of really simple examples. So after one of the bridge attacks in London, obviously we have Victim Services England and Wales, we have Victim Services Europe, we have the Victims Commissioner from Northern Ireland, we have Victims' Rights Alliance from Ireland, we have the Netherlands, we have Wiser Ring, we have, I could go on, there's a tremendous network that's there. And so, for example, one of the persons that was killed in one of the bridge attacks came from Romania. And so Victim Support Europe, it was very easy because the network to simply be able to connect the Romanian victim services with the UK victim services so that they could minimize that kind of communication support that's required for the families. And I can tell you another person that was killed on the bridge was a Canadian who lost his fiancée, and as a result of the connections, the amount of support that was put in place when he returned to Canada. So I'm just using really simple examples to talk about that responsiveness. There are a lot of peer support groups that are out there internationally that work with victims of terrorism and mass violence. And for example, there's a new one that just started after the Brussels attack. It's again a peer V support, V Europe. And Philippe had been at our symposium, and then he had a question, was looking for some expertise. So with one simple email, we have the Israeli Natal group, their national trauma and resiliency group that's part of our team as well. And they just simply said, no problem, we'll set up a expert panel for you on a phone call within the next day. So there's simple things that we can do, and one of the reasons we find that we really connect in our so it's because of the flexibility and the fact that we aren't part of a formal organization, but yet we have that trust and relationship to be able to do that. So expanding the network. So I said I wear many hats. I wear 6, but I'm only going to speak to a couple here today. I'm an executive member of the Executive Advisory Board for an organization called Leadership and Counterterrorism Alumni Association. And what that is it is an association that brings together the top law enforcement intelligence leaders from the Five Eyes countries. For those of you that aren't aware of the Five Eyes is the UK, Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. And so we have had a conference for the last 8 years in a row. Actually, the last 3 years we partnered with NYPD. So we actually just had it in Lower Manhattan here for the last 3 years. One of the things that I try and do and bring to the table is to put a victims panel together. So some of the speakers, because I want to influence the key leaders. And I can tell you that the leaders that are in this room, and when I say the kind of speakers we get, it is the commissioner of the NYPD, it is the Director Ray from the FBI, actually Director Comey's been there as well, the former director. But more importantly, we're an association, so we use Chatham House rules. So we have the most amazing dialogue. It's not just people up here speaking, it's about tackling some of the toughest issues. And so one of the titles, for example, in my panel would be incorporating victims' issues into your counterterrorism strategy. How have you prepared to look at not just the short-term needs, the immediate response needs to support victims, but also the medium and long-term? So Mary's been a speaker. I will proudly tell you that Mary and Frank Fetchit are the only members of the Leadership and Counterterrorism Association who never graduated from the program, because you must graduate from the program. So Mary and Frank have been very specially our members of the Link alumni as well. And actually, for the first time ever next year, we'll be hosting in Canada. So I can honestly say, for the last 8 years, when you've looked at the evolution of these police and intelligence leaders, they are so committed to wanting to take back to their organizations and do this. And so we provide, using this network, we provide a conduit to influence those police leaders to ensure that they have those strategies in place. And again, and the other thing I wanted to mention is, if you're not aware, there is a brand new organization starting called Victim Support Asia. And Frida Weldon, who used to be the policy person for Victim Support Europe, is the executive director of that. And they're planning their first ever, they've got 11 or 12 countries on board now, and they're going to have their first ever conference in Seoul, Korea next March. So many of us are helping Frida and are part of the Victim Support Asia to help her to stand that up. So that's just another, it's called expanding the network and being able to open doors or be a conduit for people who are looking for information, expertise, or lesson learned. So now I just want to kind of finish up with, how does that influence? Because it's great that I'm part of this and we're learning from this and all the experiences. How do we bring that back to my own country? So let me just make this statement. We have fantastic victim service providers in Canada. We have a lot of great people supporting victims. What we don't have is them trained to a level, from what I've seen from around the world, what I consider two of the best programs from a police service based. One is the FBI model, which you're going to be hearing about. The other is the UK's FLO program, the Family Liaison Officer program. So Detective Chief Inspector Pete Sparks, who's also a member of our international group, but who we've worked for 7 or 8 years, also presented at Link many times, is probably one of the most knowledgeable. So we are building on and learning from the great work that's done in order to enhance the capacity in our country to put together the kind of, I would use the word maybe program office, and I'm going to talk about the 3 pillars that we're basing that on in 1 second. But I just put in, so I know this is televised, or it's going on video, so I have to be careful. Perhaps the Canadian government and the recommendations didn't quite go as where they should. So we went to the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, and within one committee meeting, unanimous approval. Let's move forward on this. So the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police has formed a new national working group, which I have the honor of chairing. And our working group reports to the Counterterrorism and National Security Committee. And I'll talk about where we just recently went through our planning and some of our directives we're going to be working on for the next year. So we want to identify best practices, obviously, in responding to incidents, which are rooted in evidence-based models, tools, and lessons learned both from Canada, because we've had our own incidents, but also from the international context. We're going to, and I have to put this in because Karen, her section chief, she did a presentation in Dublin. I went, oh, I'm stealing that. That is so awesome. And it just really, for me, it really solidifies, because I think when you're trying to tell people what change needs to happen, sometimes if you can they can visualize in simple terms. One is predictable challenges and practical solutions. So Karen and her team and Kathryn's team have looked at so many responses and the lessons learned, that they clearly said, here's clear 5 predictable challenges and here's the practical solutions you need to have in place. So we've looked at, the other thing is, Canada, as I said, we have excellent service delivery. What we don't have is a special victim specialist training program in our country. So part of what we're going to take on is examine what will work in our country and how we're going to facilitate that. I've already asked Kathryn, she's coming to the course training standards session we'll be holding in Ottawa in the next month or two. So we're going to bring together the existing training that already occurs, what we see as some of the best programs, and then work at developing that. And I see that as very achievable in the next year. And the next thing we look at is supporting guidance to the committee in terms of being available to them if they're looking for advice or guidance, either on an actual incident or in preparing for that. I'm a big proponent that if you have to, I used to chair emergency management too, but if you have to pull out a binder in a crisis, it's too late. It's too late. The ship has sailed. So it's all about pre-planning. It's all about ensuring the people you're asking to do the task have that framework, have the plan in place, and can execute that plan with the appropriate training and support in place, and not one-time training, ongoing training. And the other is that my previous life, I was the ombudsman, so I constantly made recommendations to the government of Canada on how to better meet the needs of victims in our country. And I'm very proud to say that during our tenure, the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights came into effect. So these are the kind of things that we'll be able to, because the Chiefs Association can and does make recommendations to the federal government, so we'll be assisting them with that as well. And the other is to leverage the existing networks of service providers on the two. I just use those 2 that I just spoke about as examples. So really, when I look at the 3 pillars that we want to try to continue to enhance and develop capacity around in our country, no surprise to anybody, I have to laugh, because when I was doing that, we recently had a planning session at the annual Chiefs Conference in Halifax just a couple of weeks ago, and Karen came down and did a phenomenal presentation to our planning committee, but also to the entire counterterrorism committee. So I want to thank you, Kathryn, because I have it with me. I said, oh, there's my plan for the next year. But I will be using Pete as well from the UK. So the pillars are obviously research and development. The FBI, Karen would say planning, training and accreditation, training, direct support and consultation, executing. Now I've added a 4th, because across this continuum you need to start to looking at technology. Everyone knows that one of the biggest things that victims will tell you is, particularly in the immediate, and this is what a lot of the response is, their need for information is one of the top needs that they have there. And we have to start looking at, I don't know about you, but in a crisis, the first thing somebody's gonna go to is what everybody carries, it's their phone. And so, little apps like Citizen Aid or, SAMHSA, the mental health one here in the US, there's all kinds of things and tools, but one of the ones I wanna, by the way, I never leave anybody unless I leave you with resources as well. Mary, am I fitting this in 15 minutes? Because that's unheard of, eh? Yeah. So, and by the way, these slides will be left, you can all have them. This is not to say that this is, the only expertise that's out there, but we often get asked, people just starting, well, where would I look? And you look at the DOJ, you look at Mary's Voices, the FLO program, the FBI services, Global for Madrid did something. And Heidi's here from the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime in Canada, and they did something called terrorvictimresponse.ca. So these are just hyperlinks. You've got the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, the Globalization Pact. Portugal actually did some work recently. England and Wales did one recently. And then this one I want everybody to get on and Google. This is from Victor and Jammers in the Netherlands. And so again, technology is a tool. It's a tool, it's something in your toolkit, right? But one of the things that impressed me about this, many of you will remember not too long ago, the MH17 flight that was shot down over Ukraine. And a large number of people on that plane came from the Netherlands. Within 24 hours, they had this website up. And I wish I had the technological, Sue too hasn't developed her technological expertise yet to actually put up the video and get online. So when you go to this hyperlink, you will get this that comes up. If it comes up in Dutch, just Google it to Google Translate to English. And what I want you to look at is the kind of headers that they have. And I would say that 90% of this could be preloaded. So why practical matters? How do I get a death certificate? How do I talk to a friend who's grieving who lost somebody on the flight? I mean, I'm really minimizing the categories that are there. And then they hyperlink. But what they've done with this website is that if you are a victim or family, you will get a special PIN and you can access. And it's continually backloaded at the other side. Now, this is a very expensive thing. I'm hoping they're at the stage to buy licenses shortly, because what they did, they work with two organizations in the Netherlands called Arc and Impact. Some of you may be aware of them. I do a lot of psychosocial work. And Arc and Impact worked with them, and they basically did a pilot last year where they went to their police station and said, give us your worst case scenario on how to support victims. They had it up and running within 2 hours. So we have to start thinking like that and pre-planning around these kinds of initiatives that are out there as tools. I'm not saying they're just a tool in the tool basket. But I look at our country and I look at the United States, and every time there's an incident that happens here, within hours, here's your 1-800 number if you have this, and here's where you can get support, and even Mary's crew, they have it their way. I just want to bring our country up to having some of those capacities and frameworks in place to do that. And I guess what I want to say to you is we're here as well to share anything if we can assist you in any way. But I think it's so important, and what we're doing here is not replacing anything, it's simply adding capacity, so that we can start to network. And I could give you 20 more examples of where, even on the responsive side, just practical. Recently, we had 2 attacks, one in the shooting on Danforth in Toronto, and also the van attack in Toronto. And then we had an incident in Fredericton recently. I can tell you that I was able to reach out to those leaders, and one of them in particular, I know there's a tremendous amount of expertise with children in this room, but when the Manchester attack happened, she said, I have 1 minute. I'm going to finalize in 1 minute. So when the Manchester attack happened, one of our colleagues, Ilsa, was able to put together a video which was shown to every victim service worker responding to Manchester. And she shared that with me, and I was able to share that with some of my colleagues with her permission. And just like a lot of the expertise that was talked about here about trauma and how it impacts, and setting expectations, what you can do as a victim support worker, what you shouldn't set expectations around. And when I talked to the people that use that tape as the actual service providers, they said it was so helpful to them. And there was just an immediate tool to be able to use to support. So I'm going to stop there, but simply to say, Mary, and the work you're doing here and thank you to everyone in this room, because every one of you is here because you want to make a difference for victims and their families. I know we have many victims in the room who have lost and suffered. And it's us also. One thing the best thing I could do as an ombudsman was be an active listener. And so I've had the privilege of listening to victims from across our country and elsewhere. And that's my passion. My passion is change. So I am honored to work with the people I do with our network and be able to continue that. With that, I will stop, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Kathryn, who has been so helpful to our group. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here. And I think Mary and I can't even remember how far back we go. Sue as well. So I don't know what that says about our age, but I'm going to take it as a good sign. So the FBI, a lot of people don't know that the FBI has this other side to it. And we really didn't have it until after 9/11. But before 9/11, the FBI wasn't resourced. We didn't have the positions. We didn't have the people to really respond to victims' needs. And the FBI has a legal responsibility as a federal investigative agency to ensure that victims of federal crimes investigated by the FBI receive the rights, the information, and the support services that they're entitled to under the law. And in the FBI, thanks to our first director, when I came in, Director Mueller, we go beyond that on a regular basis. That's the floor, not the ceiling, in terms of what we try to do for victims. So whether it's the 47 victim specialists in my program who work in Indian country on Native American tribes, or whether it's folks who work here in New York City or in our office dealing with terrorism, whether they're doing forensic interviews of kids, whatever, we really try to go above and beyond. So Director Mueller took over the FBI 4 days before 9/11. Within 3 months, he had created the Office for Victim Assistance. And about 2 weeks later, I was not shanghaied, I was recruited very vigorously to come across from the Department of Justice to run the office. We started with 5 people at headquarters and about 6 in the field. We now have over 300 people around the FBI, victim specialists, operational psychologists, and support staff, child interviewers. So we established a terrorism and victim services unit, a terrorism and special jurisdiction unit in 2003. And then we created a FLY team, it's what they call it in the FBI, but a victim assistance sort of rapid deployment team. after the Red Lake shooting on the Indian reservation. And we had to very quickly mobilize victim specialists to go to that shooting. And we really needed to kind of know what we were doing and expand our capacity to respond to multi-victim crimes. So that FLY team I'll talk about is now called the Victim Services Response Team. One of the other good things that happened, we're a federal agency, we're heavily resourced. Our program is 99.2% funded by the Federal Crime Victims Fund, which is money that comes from offenders who are plead guilty to or convicted of federal crimes in the United States. So after the shootings at Sandy Hook, Congress passed a bill called the Investigative Assistance for Violent Crime Act. And that bill gives the FBI director, the ability to deploy all available FBI assets and resources to support a state or local community in the aftermath of a crime that includes 3 or more victims and a crime in a public place. So that has made a big difference for us. It has certainly added a lot to our workload and our capacity. Our capacity these days, we have a kind of just by default, really, because we've been doing this for so long, kind of an unusual level of expertise. I am on my 29th year of working with Pan Am 103 families. We also have cases going back to the 1970s. We're in the process now of getting ready to return personal effects to families of victims from the 1978 Jonestown, Guyana People's Temple massacre. So we stay with these cases a long time. Karen Joyce McMahon was the person who led the Columbine shooting response for the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. So we have now close to 200 victim services providers across the country. They form a network. So even within a regular FBI case, if we have a victim of a crime who's maybe kidnapped from Durham, North Carolina, to Missouri, our victim specialists in North Carolina and in Missouri will work together on both ends to make sure that victims get what they need. They know their resources. They have to have at least a bachelor's degree in social behavioral sciences, so we hire a lot of social workers, a lot of mental health providers. They don't do therapy, but they do assessments with victims. They try to make sure that they incorporate good mental health practice into their work with victims and everything we try to do to support victims. Our National Victim Services Response Team, we used to just have victim specialists in some of our staff, and about 3 or 4 years ago, we expanded it to include agents, evidence recovery specialists, and analysts. And they have different functions, but they're all geared towards supporting the immediate needs of victims and families. So even though we don't provide therapy, we don't act as mental health providers, we have, I think, a really good understanding of the fact that how we collectively, but law enforcement and responders, work with victims and families, how we treat them, what we say, when we say it, all of these things have a long-term impact, not just on that immediate situation where you have families who are desperate for information, who are looking for compassionate and practical support in the immediate aftermath. If all of this is done well, if it's done the right way at the right time, it's going to help support victims and families going forward and survivors. If they have bad experiences in the initial aftermath, that only becomes a negative part of the total experience and can have an impact on how well people manage, how willing they are to seek help and to seek information that can be really important. So our team, as a matter of fact, they're in Kansas City starting today. There's 120 of our folks who are going through advanced training. We've just expanded the team again. They're getting training, they're doing an exercise, they're really getting trained on our protocol and how we handle our responses. So they provide on-scene assistance, crisis intervention, death notification, coordination of support services to hospitalized victims and families of deceased victims. One of the things we do, because it sounds simple but it isn't, is we can go in and we can help develop a victim list. That victim list is very important. You need to know who the victims are and have contact information for their next of kin. We need to know how to reach out to people very quickly so they can get information and assistance. And like I said, it's not very easy. Most of the instances that we've responded to in the United States and that we've worked with overseas are multinational victims. You have, a lot of people don't know, Vegas shootings, 90% of the affected people were not from Nevada. They're from multiple countries all over the United States, pockets of families and victims across the United States. So even the shooting in Santa Fe, Texas, the school shooting, there was a student from Pakistan that was killed. So we're working with her family in Pakistan. So the other thing that we've learned that is very important is the cleaning and return of personal effects, whether these are items that a victim had with them. Maybe it was a survivor who ran and lost their phone, but you know what we all keep on our phones? Our whole lives are on our phones, our contact, our photos, everything. Car keys, being able to get into a car. After the Pulse shooting in Orlando, all of the cars that were in the parking lot, the people who had been at the nightclub, were impounded. They were taken away by the Orlando police. One of the things our team did was work with the police department and either survivors or the families of the deceased or partners of the deceased to get car keys made, because a lot of the keys were lost or they were in evidence somewhere, and make sure that we could get the keys and we could accompany people to go to their cars and get them or retrieve their loved one's car. And I remember one of our folks had gone with a guy who lost his partner, and as soon as he got in the car, I'm so glad we had someone with him, when he turned it on, this radio was playing a song that had meant a lot to both of them when they were driving up to the club. So at Charleston, the church shooting there, and Mary particularly asked me to mention this, the locals had come in and cleaned or retrieved a lot of the personal belongings and things from the room where the shootings had taken place, and they had thrown most of it away. So our visit team members, particularly the agents and the ERT folks, went and put on suits and climbed through dumpsters looking for things like family Bibles that belonged to some of the victims. Things that had been in their families meant a lot to them. So we were able to get those things out, take them to a contractor that we have in Texas they can clean and decontaminate and restore almost anything. So returning those things that are so valuable to people has really become an aspect of this process that we hadn't really anticipated, but it's become a big part of it. We try to make sure that people get investigative updates. Death notification, I don't have to tell you if you've been in the position of having to receive a death notification. If it's done well, you don't notice necessarily, or at least you feel the compassion of the people who are delivering it. If it's done poorly, it can have an impact for the rest of people's lives. So we worked several years ago with Penn State University to develop an online training on death notification, and then we are working now with their students, their graduate students in their IT department, to develop an app that will be available on Google Play Store and on Apple. So that app will be available. The training online has been viewed by about 40,000 people worldwide so far. Our team can deploy anywhere in the United States, and when we're in the lead, the FBI, of course, will have a more prominent role, but many, many times we are supporting state and local organizations and agencies. These are some of the responses that we've done since 2007, really. You can see we have victim specialists who are in the local area. We try to get them there as quickly as possible to start assessing the situation. What we found is that these events are like lightning strikes. They're highly random, highly unpredictable, and high profile. And many, many communities, even those that have crisis response plans, aren't necessarily really prepared for what's going to happen. So often what we can do is come in and at least, as Sue said, help them understand what the predictable challenges are and some of the practical solutions that can help it all go a lot more smoothly. And there are things that are very common in every one of these instances, but there's always a new twist. There's always something, a new factor or something that families have to deal with. And so we try to adjust to those and problem solve as we go. We have this anti-terrorism and mass violence funding. It's unique to the FBI. It comes from the Federal Crime Victims Fund. But we have 2 credit cards, magic credit cards. There's $1 million transaction limit on both. And we can use that to do emergency travel for victims and families. We can do it very quickly. They don't even have to call the airline. We'll do it for them. We can make their lodging arrangements and pay for them. We can reimburse them for some things. And in the process right now, we have a couple of victims of the Amsterdam train attack, American citizens. Yesterday, I just signed or paid for the medevac of one of the most severely injured to come back to the United States. Had insurance, but not insurance to cover the cost, very expensive cost of medically transporting someone back to the United States. We can pay for all kinds of services, replacement of keys, things like that, crime scene cleanup and cleaning and return of personal effects. The other thing that we do is we will, at different periods of time, particularly if it's an FBI case, FBI-led case like the Pulse, we will bring people back who want to come for a victim briefing so that they can understand what's happening in the investigation. One of our rules of thumb is we try very hard, and sometimes we don't get it because you have CNN and everybody ahead of us, but we try very hard to make sure that victims and families hear important information from us first before they get it in the media. We owe them that. We owe them the information that belongs to them more than anybody else. The way we look at it in the FBI is we have a special relationship with our victims and survivors and victims' families. We have a different level of obligation and responsibility to them than we do to the general public or Congress or anybody else who pings us on a regular basis for information. We can, like Sue told you about the Ukrainian crash, we also have a website that we set up very quickly. Boston Marathon bombing was one of the first times we did it, but one of the things we put it up, we get it out through our public affairs, through Twitter, and it basically has information on immediate support, like in Las Vegas, where the Family Assistance Center is being set up, where to go, what 800 number to call, what services are available if you need emergency support, and then there's something called seeking victims. So if we have people who walk away, one of the things we define in the federal system is as a victim, that's a legal designation, are people who are injured, who physically or mentally, emotionally injured, families of the deceased, and what we call present but not injured. And that's a lot of people who were there. Las Vegas, 22,000 people in that venue. Many people saw a lot of things, went through a lot of things that really do make them vulnerable and in need of assistance, or at least the opportunity to receive it. So we do that. We help coordinate national resources. We're in the process of working on an MOA with the Red Cross because we end up often, our two agencies will be at many of these scenes and have learned to work together very well. We can coordinate with the Justice Department. The State Department oversees embassies because we have FBI offices in about 90 different embassies and consulates overseas. Any other federal or agency, we can work with the state crime victims compensation programs as well to coordinate so that they know what we're paying for with our emergency funds and they know that they can pay for funerals, burials, and all the other things that they could normally do. We try to, when we go into a community in one of these responses, we really try to leave that community better positioned to try to move forward. We'll sit down with all of their victim service providers and their agencies. And if they're interested, we'll let them know kind of what we've seen in other incidences and provide lessons learned from all of our responses. We also are in the process now of circling back to all of those events over the last year. Last year we had Las Vegas, Tribeca here in New York, Sutherland Springs, Parkland and Santa Fe, all within about a 5-month period. So we're going back to all of those communities to sit down with their folks and say, you know, what helped, what would have been better, what can we do in the future. So one of the things we always try to do, these are just some of the things that we've found are going to be challenges. We always try to make sure that we listen to victims as well. Everything that we do, as Sue said, one of the opportunities she had as an ombudsman was just to listen to victims. Everything that we do and the way we do it needs to be meaningful and relevant to the people that we're serving. So we're constantly retooling. We're very interested always in getting feedback, not just from our partners that we work with and in communities, but particularly from victims and families. And we take what we hear from them very seriously. We use it to sort of educate our folks. We use it to inform our process and our procedures and even our resources. So it's a constant, we never have it nailed. You just don't have it nailed. And we try to also, as much as we can go forward with victims and families over a long period of time, to also see the impact of the crime and also of how we've worked with them. So it is, like I said, it's never a done deal. We're always trying to learn. So what we've identified as some of the most important things is just to be prepared, to collaborate for maximum benefit, to reach out to victims as soon as possible. Don't make them come to us, or not make them try to make information easily available. Understand that what information you provide a victim or a family on one day, they may hear just the first part of it. When people are in trauma, we try to make sure that we give people information both verbally and in writing, and we make it available over and over again. And we also tell people, victims and families that we work with, you may not think you need this right now. It may not be something you're interested in or ready to do, but or information you may not be interested in hearing at this point. But here's our information. You can come back to us at any time. And I'll tell you, I have on my desk 15 requests from 9/11 family members coming out in recent years, just in the last year, asking for information that we are researching in our case files. We have a lot of information that's evidence, but we also have a lot of information that's not necessarily evidentiary, but it has meaning to victims and families. So one lady whose husband was killed at the Pentagon who wants to know exactly where he was found and what he may have been doing at the time he died. So those are the kinds of things that we will research till we find what we need and try to give them those answers. Developing that complete victim list and recognizing that the needs of the injured, the families of the deceased, present not injured, and responders are in somewhat similar, but they are also very different in other ways. So we really try to tailor our teams and our approach to those victims in different ways. In the safe haven, what we found is families in the immediate aftermath, whether they're an injured victim with family in the hospital or they're a family of a deceased victim, is they need a safe place to go for information, for practical and compassionate support, and to be able to understand and hear about what they can expect in the future and where they go for information and where they go for help. So that safe haven, I think, is really important. We find that the family assistance centers that get set up, or victim resource centers, can be really important for families to get away from the media, to get away from all the well-wishers, to get away from the politicians, to get away from all the stuff going on, and just be together and be able to get information and support. Be prepared for diversity. The Sikh temple shooting, when we responded, we didn't have people in our team who really understood that culture. So we reached out and got a Punjabi-speaking agent and an analyst from another part of the FBI, made them part of our team. With Pulse, we incorporated members of the FBI director's LGBTQ advisory committee, employee advisory committee. They came and supported, participated with our team. They helped open doors with the LGBTQ community in Orlando that also then enabled them to access some additional resources that they didn't have in their community. Maximize flexibility, minimize bureaucracy, information. You can see the truth and nothing but the truth, but allow families to decide how much they want to know and when they want to know it. Identify and meet those basic needs, protect victims' privacy, value the things they carried with them, and plan for the long term. So as I said, we're not mental health providers ourselves, but we teach our people how to assess and stay in touch with victims and families, and when they're ready for mental health resources or counseling or any form of therapy, then we try to work with them to identify the best options in their community. If we don't have them, then we reach out to a variety of mental health providers, experts that we know around the country, and use them to tap their network. So this is our goal: to deliver a response that's victim-centered and relevant, timely and forward-leaning, trauma-informed, agile, flexible, and scalable. You can't believe how important that is, because you may have to pivot every now and then collaborative, and then sustainable beyond the immediate crisis. The one thing I will say when it talks about the long term particularly is we have, just this morning, I got an email from a Pan Am 103 family member who lost his brother on the plane. His parents have since died. As a young man, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He's alone in the world. He really has nobody. And about once a month, either I check in with him or he checks in with me. And I can always tell when he's gone off his meds. So all these years later, we still have an active case for Pan Am 103. So the FBI is still investigating that with the Scottish authorities. But these relationships with victims and families will last as long as they need to. So that's our commitment, and that's our goal. So thank you very much.
Well, good morning. So I'm going to start with two kind of announcements. The first is I do have copies of the presentation. So if any of you want copies of the slides, because I'll show resources, but it's a little hard to write them down that quickly, I'm going to put them here and you can pick them up afterwards. And I'm also going to just add to my introduction that my training is in developmental behavioral pediatrics. So unapologetically, I'm going to be focusing on children. But I do want to say that almost everything I say is going to be relevant for adults as well. So even if you're not thinking about the needs of children, basic needs really are very similar for adults as well. So what I wanted to start with was really in the recovery phase from any event, because I'm going to be talking in general. How do you support children and families after a crisis, no matter what that crisis is? Often what you have to focus on initially is those basic supportive services, such as safety, security, food, water, place to live, all of those things. And I remember going to New Orleans. It was about 4 months after Katrina. Someone told me the story that they were at Mass. In the middle of the sermon, someone's cell phone went off. The audience made a lot of noise. And the minister just stopped the sermon and he said, "You know what? That call might be your contractor. You better answer it." And what he communicated to the congregation was even the word of God, literally, is not as important as making sure that you're safe and that you have a place to live. And the person who told me that story just looked at me and said, "My minister, he really gets it." And that's what we want to be able to do. For all the people we interact with who have been through crisis events, we want them to know we do get them. Now, this is often the focus, the primary focus in the immediate aftermath. But the reality is basic needs persist, often for years afterwards. And so I know the prior presenters were talking about some excellent resources to meet some of those basic needs, but we have to realize that it can continue that way. I went out, just to illustrate this, I went out to Sonoma after the wildfires, and I was talking to a group of pediatricians. And they told me, every time a patient comes in now, we ask them, was their home damaged in the fires? And I said, well, that's a good first question. But sometimes you really don't see the complexity of what's happened to families just when you ask one question. So I told them when I was in New Orleans, I was talking with some educators, and one of the teachers spoke to me and she said, I lived in the French Quarter, and when the hurricane came, my apartment was completely undamaged. No water damage, nothing. And she said, but the problem was about 4 months later, my lease ran out, and they doubled the rent because there was no affordable housing in New Orleans. And so she said, as a result, I couldn't afford it on a teacher's salary. So I had to move about an hour away, or 45 minutes to an hour away. But that meant I had to take my daughter out of high school. She then became very depressed. I got her started on some medication, but I couldn't really arrange for counseling because we were commuting almost an hour, and I was pretty much living out of my car. So someone suggested we get a pet, so I got her a dog. The dog attacked someone in the throat. I'm going to trial next week, and I'm likely to be bankrupt according to my attorney. So you think about the basic needs that people have, it's not just what happened that day. It's actually everything that follows. And a crisis often initiates a cascade of secondary losses and stressors. So if you think about the natural disaster that I mentioned, it can require a relocation, which leads to a loss of peer networks, academic failures, trouble integrating into new social networks. And these natural disasters can lead to financial stresses, which then cause parental stress, parental mental health problems or worsening of parental mental health problems, marital conflict, domestic violence. Any of those stressors may actually be the problem the child's focusing on. So when they come to school and they've been up all night because their parents were arguing, because mom's business closed, because there weren't as many tourists, because there was a flood, and he's worried that mom and dad are going to get divorced and he's not going to see mom or dad anymore, and you start asking him what happened on the day of the flood, you're missing his problem, because it's really what's happening to him now. So we don't want to focus solely on post-traumatic symptoms of an event, of a singular event, but ask them what the challenges are that they're focusing on now. Now, I went over an example about a natural disaster. This same thing happens with shootings and terrorist attacks. I'm just going to go over these very quickly because I think you all know them, and I'm happy to answer questions about them during the question period, but I want to make sure we leave time for that. So it can be sleep problems, and if people don't sleep well, they don't function well when they're awake. So sleep becomes an important initial symptom to work on. You also see separation anxiety and school avoidance. So kids are often reluctant to separate from loved ones, to go to school because they're afraid something's going to happen to them if they're not with their parents, or that something may happen to their parents or other extended family members if they are not there somehow to protect them as well. Children also may become anxious and have trauma-related fears, and I think people anticipate the trauma-related fears. There's been a shooting, so loud noises frighten them. But they may also become fearful of the dark, even if the shooting happened during daylight. So they become more anxious, and people don't always anticipate and address that as well. They may also become irritable and have difficulties with concentration, and that leads to problems in academic functioning. And children may also demonstrate regressive behavior. And I think most people expect that with kids, that if it's a kindergartner that didn't have problems being left off in kindergarten, now may become more clingy because they become somewhat regressed. But it also includes social regression, and people don't talk about that as much. So they may become more demanding, more self-centered, more irritable, more cranky, more inflexible. And guess what? You see that in adults just as much, if not more so. I went to one community where they had had a very large natural disaster, and I was meeting with the parents on the first day back to school. And unfortunately, there was a storm that day, and this was a community that had had severe weather problems, so that everyone was a little bit anxious. And before we got started, I asked the parents, how old are your kids? And one woman just looked at me and she said, well, I have a number of children, but there are two I'm most worried about. One is 5 and one is 35, and I'm most worried about the 35-year-old. Her husband was standing next to her. He started crying, picked up one of the toddlers, and left. So the issue is this type of regression does not just occur in children. It occurs among the staff. When we go into schools after shootings, often our question is, have the teachers decreased the amount they're yelling at the students? We don't ask whether or not they're yelling. We just ask if it's starting to get a little bit better. And you will see that among professionals, and you will see it among mental health professionals who do trauma work. They also have somewhat regressive behavior too. You can see, obviously, when something bad or tragic has happened, kids may be sad, as you would expect, and they may show signs of depression. You may also see substance abuse. You may see new onset or an increase in substance use. I went to Sichuan, China after the earthquake there, and I visited one school, and the entire school had been leveled. And about 40% of the students and staff died, and the other 60% were rescued. They were dug out of the rubble. And as I was standing in a tent in the resettlement community, I asked one of the teachers how the kids were doing. This was in middle school, and he said the kids are smoking more. And then I looked at him and I asked, how are you doing? He was standing right next to his principal, and he said, I drink every night to go to sleep. And I see this a lot, and so we really have to recognize the fact that substance use may be an issue, and unfortunately most crisis response plans don't incorporate specific plans for substance abuse counseling, and that's something I see as a gap. You'll also see somatization. So a lot of individuals that have psychological distress after these events may present actually with physical symptoms, and we have to work with them to recognize that they really need some supportive services. But the tricky part about this is they don't just present, physical symptoms are not just a sign of emotional distress after a crisis. Sometimes it's a sign of physical problems, and those increase as well. Now, obviously, you can have exposures as some of the people that were at the 9/11 site, so they may get physical problems because of that. But you can also get it just from stress hormones. So increase in problems with diabetes and asthma. I was talking with one principal after he returned. It was several weeks after a shooting that had happened in his school. And I met with him. I mean, the delay was because he had had a heart attack and was going through bypass surgery. So he arrives back at school, and he looks at me and he goes, I'm not the only one that has stress-related health problems here. Do you ever see that after a shooting? And I looked at him, I said, are you asking me if stress-related health problems increase after stressful events? And he said, yes. And I go, yes, they do. Now, so that's not to minimize it. It's just you have to recognize that this principal is recovering from a heart attack, recovering from the trauma of living through a mass shooting, and also trying to deal with running a school in that setting. So that's where these situations, they become so complicated. And so it isn't just one problem. it's really a large number of problems. Now, children may also demonstrate trauma symptoms or symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I wasn't going to go over that because I think you've gotten presentations on that earlier today. I do have a slide that I can show you during the question and answers if you would like to. But the point that I want to add is not to minimize anything about the trauma that occurs in these events or the symptoms or disorders that follow, but rather to say that there's actually a far wider range of reactions and concerns beyond post-traumatic symptoms and disorders. Some of it relates to that cascade of losses and secondary stressors that I mentioned, that if you just have a unitary focus on post-traumatic reactions from an event, you will miss a lot of the problems. But it may also be bereavement is the issue for some individuals, as opposed to the trauma of the cause of death. I went to one community after there had been a community-based mass shooting. And they asked me to speak to one young man. He was at the event where the shooting occurred, and the person on either side of him was shot and killed, but he actually was uninjured. And he had come back to school for about an hour or two one day, and otherwise was staying home. He wasn't taking phone calls. He was accepting text messages. He communicated by text. And he had declined all counseling. So I went to his home, we texted him, and he said, sure, you can come over. And I asked him, why aren't you getting any counseling? And he said, well, you know what? The event happened very quickly. I was pulled out before I knew what was going on. I had some trauma symptoms for about a week, but they've gone away. I couldn't sleep, I was jittery. And he goes, but that's not really my problem. And I said, well, why aren't you willing to go out of your home? And he goes, I go out of my home every day. I go and I meet with my friends who were there at the event. They understand what I'm going through. And then he looked at me and he goes, I'm going camping this weekend. I don't know why everyone assumes I'm scared. I'm not frightened. And I said, well, why aren't you in school? And he looked at me and he goes, well, it didn't feel right to be there. And I said, why didn't it feel right? And he said, because she wasn't there. He was on a date with someone he planned on marrying. He was planning on marrying this girl that he had known all of his life, and she was dead, and it wasn't right to be in school without her. And so I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he looked surprised, and he looked at me and he goes, that's it. And if someone will talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling today. I don't want to talk about the shooting anymore. So the issue is we don't consider the other needs of populations if we become so trauma-focused that we don't see the breadth of the needs that victims sometimes have. It also becomes even more confusing because it's not just what happened and what follows. It's actually everything that preceded the event that may be resurfaced when they're in the stress of the situation. I worked with one school. What had happened was they had a field trip of high school students, and while they were on the bus, one of the girls opened a bottle that was on a necklace that had been given to her. Apparently she didn't know what it was. It was actually a personal protective device, and it had the liquid concentrate of what's in pepper spray. You're supposed to open it when you're attacked. You are not supposed to open it on a school bus. So what happened was the bus was filled with noxious fumes. Kids started vomiting, having asthma attacks. Nobody knew what it was. She did not come forward and volunteer that information, as you can imagine. So they evacuated the bus into a fast food restaurant, contaminated the fast food restaurant. Someone reached the conclusion that this was a chemical terrorist attack and they needed to do on-site decontamination. And she just said, okay, my bad, we're not doing that. So they stopped that, put him on a clean bus, brought him to an emergency room, and did a controlled decontamination, where girls one by one went into one shower in the ambulance bay, boys one by one went into another shower. They dressed in clean clothes that had somehow been acquired. I really don't even know how they got all this new clothing, but anyway, they assembled them, they provided cookies and punch, showed them cartoons, had child life specialists. They went over the top in the response. And unlike the other situations, they gave them back all their things. One girl lost a boot. So anyway, I'm talking with the school a couple weeks afterwards, and they're asking, what did we do wrong? And I'm like, cookies and punch and cartoons with high school students? That's over the top good. Like, that's never gonna happen again. And they said, there are 2 girls who are still having panic attacks and they can't come back to school. I said, I wasn't there and I don't know these kids, but I don't think it had anything to do with what happened that day. Look to find out what's in the lives of these children. There's something you don't know. One girl, it didn't take long. She was new to the school. She had transferred in a week before. When they asked why, and I don't know why they didn't ask that to begin with, they found out her mother had been murdered a week prior. And that's why she was having panic attacks. The other girl, they said, no, we've talked with the girl, we've talked with the parents. There are no stressors. And I just looked at them and I go, there are. You just haven't found it. They then found out that she was being sexually assaulted by her father. And that's why she was having panic attacks. So the issue is when you go in to deal with an event, you're dealing with people. People have histories. You're not dealing with one event. You're dealing with anything that ever upset them. And that's where it can get so complicated. And by the way, it's equally so with the adults, and it's also true with the first responders, the mental health staff as well. And what happens is, despite all these needs, adults tend to underestimate the extent of children's reactions to crisis situations, especially related to how they feel internally. This is one of the posters that Project Liberty used in New York City about 6 months after 9/11. The signs are not that easy to read because individuals tend to withhold them because it makes them feel that they're abnormal or they're somehow inappropriate, or they simply don't want to distress the adults who are already upset around them. So the last thing I kind of wanted to go over is just what is the journey of recovery. Whenever I go to events, there are a couple questions I can always anticipate. One of them is, when do we go back to the way we were? And I said, that's easy. You never do. You can never go back in time, so you can only go forward. So let's talk about what that forward process is. Well, we all have a baseline of adjustment. If you think about adjustment over time. In individuals, it's not a straight line. They have days where things are going better, and they have days where they're stressed or overwhelmed or distressed. People tend to look at the distress and say, look, they're in crisis. Well, they're not in crisis, they're distressed. And a crisis is not defined by the event, but it is defined by the individuals or the organization's capacity to recover without external support. Individuals and communities that are resilient may experience the same amount of distress as individuals or communities in crisis. It's just they can cope with it. So that's also an important thing to keep in mind, is just because someone can cope with distress does not mean that they don't warrant support, because they can have the same amount of distress as someone who is able to cope with it. But eventually what happens is somebody may experience a crisis and their resources to respond and their capacity to cope are overwhelmed, and they are now in crisis. And at point C, they're feeling vulnerable, and at D, their usual coping mechanisms have failed. And at that point, communities come together. People provide help and assistance, they talk with each other. What I do when I visit communities at that point is I say, figure out what it is that is positive that you are doing right now and commit to continuing it, because otherwise that goes away. And so we really want to make sure that whatever is a positive type of social support and networking, that you maintain it. And so what happens is, because of this support, people start to do better. But what I want to point out is that when they first start to do better, there's often this assumption, they go, look, the kids, they're resilient, they're better. They are better, but they're not all better. And there's a tendency to see improvement and assume that is reassuring, but to assume that that means you don't have to be worried. Actually, that's the most vulnerable time period. When I went to New Orleans about 4 months after Katrina, healthcare providers could list the number of healthcare providers they knew who had killed themselves since the hurricane. And what tends to happen, there actually was a supplement to Pediatrics, a medical journal, dedicated to a young pediatrician who killed himself in New Orleans. So what tends to happen is that as people are improving, they have more energy, but they look around and they see, wait, all these other people look like they're back to normal. They're probably not, but they look that way. And they think, I will never get to that point. And that's when despair sets in. Now, what's more likely to happen, few children actually do harm themselves after these events, but more likely if you withdraw the support too soon, you may get what we just call a new baseline, which I just called continued impairment. We really owe it to children to continue the support until they at least get back to their baseline. And if we give them sufficient support, some will actually exceed their baseline. This is what we call post-traumatic growth. Individuals emerge with more resiliency, more capacity to support others. They have more ability to deal with future adversity. They may change their priorities. They may actually move their professions to be able to help others. So the last story that I wanted to tell you was I was showing this slide in a community. It was actually in the New York City metropolitan area after Superstorm Sandy. And I was talking to a group of foster parents. And one of the dads said, I think that's me. And he said, you know, when 9/11 happened, I was in, not 9/11, I'm sorry, when this flooding happened, he said, you know, I actually had this experience where I had had a child before. and the child died of an infection at a young age as a toddler. And he said, I used to be in finance, and I was very successful in that work. And after my child died, it just didn't seem like a meaningful job anymore. Like, why am I making money? That's not a career. So he said, so even though I was successful, I quit my job in finance, and I went back to college to become a kindergarten teacher. And he goes, shaping the lives of young children, that's a career that I can really live with. So, and then he said, and then I became a foster parent, and now I'm adopting a child. And he said, so I think I've probably gone through post-traumatic growth. And I would say, yes, he did. The problem with post-traumatic growth, because a lot of people who go into helping professions, including mental health, education, medicine, have had loss or trauma in their childhood. The problem is they bring that forward with them as their history. And when they go to help children and adults who are in distress, it resurfaces or has an opportunity to do that. And it's distressing to be with kids who are in distress. So it's critical that adults find ways to have their own personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting children who have experienced loss or crisis. Because the very people who go to help others, such as I imagine most of you in this room, are here because you know how important it is, either because you received that help when you needed it, or you didn't, and you want to make sure others do. But that also means you bring forth your own vulnerability. So I'm going to stop there, and I have other resources that are listed on the handout, which I'm happy to give to you, but it's both online as well as written resources. So thank you.
Thank you. Those of us that were able to get a copy, there's Professor, she's handing them out there. There are some 4 great slides, and Mary, I think you put these online after, right? So there are some excellent, I had the privilege of having a look at them. We have about 5 minutes before lunch. It's Mary, I'm right on time. We have about 5, so I want to just open it up for questions to the audience. I could ask them, but quite frankly, yes, please.
I have a question for Commissioner Turman. That's the wrong title, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Do the resources that you spoke of that the FBI can deliver, are they limited to situations where there is a crime or a crime that's still being investigated as the Pan Am 103 is? Because there are some crimes in which the perpetrator has killed himself or is killed, and I wonder, does that mean the FBI disappears at that point?
No. If particularly, we have a number of these mass casualties that you've seen up there where the perpetrators are deceased. And particularly if it's an FBI-led investigation, if it's a federal crime, we will continue with people as long as they need information and support. There are other cases, Hurricane Katrina being one, where we were, it was a national emergency. So we were tasked, actually, we sent victim specialists down to work in New Orleans when Hurricane Rita happened. When the tsunami happened overseas in Asia, we also worked those disasters as well because they were high-level disasters and we're human services people, so we pitch in with the Red Cross and anybody else who's working. But we will stay, we don't turn a victim or a family away, no matter how long it's been. If there's something they need, if we can't provide it ourselves directly, we'll use our network of service providers to try to get help.
You brought a lot of history to my mind. One is that it was President Reagan, actually, who had the first commission on victims.
Yes.
I had the honor of serving.
Yes.
So it's a lot of history.
Yes.
And I did a lot of work with that. But among the resources, would you please add the United Nations resources? First, I participated in creating them, so
We're actually meeting with Joe Dover tonight. Yes, we work with the yes, CT, yes.
But also, we created it, in consensus
Absolutely.
with so many other governments. So, and in particular, as a general point, victims inform us that they have rights. Because we also created victims' rights.
Yes.
And most victims around the world, most people around the world don't even know that they have rights. And so that's really good for everyone to always bring it out. And David, do you discover multi-generational trauma when you ask people to? Because of course, that creates vulnerability in the child. in the present.
Yeah, when we're doing work, in pediatrics in general, you always work multi-generational because you can't really just work with the children, it's the parents as well. I remember talking to one parent, and she had a child who was involved in a school-based shooting. Husband killed his wife in the classroom and killed a couple other children unintentionally at the same time. And we were talking about the kid didn't want to go back to class or school, and so they did bring him back to a school, and he didn't tolerate that particularly well. And I said, well, sometimes it's also the parents. And she looked at me, she said, I sat in the parking lot and sobbed. I could not drive away. Of course it is me too. And so, but it also can be the grandparents, it can be from what they had experienced. So all work with children is intergenerational, if it's going to be effective.
I'm going to wrap up short because Mary wants to make a few comments. I want to thank you for that, because those of you who aren't aware, the United Nations actually has a counterterrorism victims counterterrorism division. They recently announced had their first ever on August 21st day for victims of terrorism. And I thank you for that, because there is a tremendous amount of work. They also just completed a recent UN handbook for victims of terrorism in different countries, so there's a lot of availability for that as well. I just want to thank the panelists because, and Mary again for the invitation to be here. There is so much knowledge. What's been talked about here this morning, the kind of expertise, we have to make sure that we have frameworks in place that are going to allow us to access and know where that knowledge is, because that's how we're going to better help families and victims. And every time I've dealt with a victim of crime, one of the most common answer, I don't want what happened to me and my family to happen to anyone else, but I want to make sure that we learn from those losses, and that we make a difference in the future for families and for people that are currently living. And I'm just going to, one last point, the continuum. I mean, ideally prevention works when it doesn't. We have a crime, and then obviously if there may or may not be a criminal justice process, but at the end of the day, for everyone involved in these, this is a lifelong journey. And along that journey, we need to ensure that victims have the information they need to make the right choices for them and know what options are available to them. I've learned a lot about PTSD and responses here this morning's panel. I just want to reassure you that we have our monthly phone call next week. Mary and I will be doing a dissertation on the amount of expertise here and relaying that to the international network. So if you start getting calls from around the world, you know where it came from. And pulling on the kind of knowledge that we've just gleaned and are going to glean tomorrow as well. So Mary, over to you, and I thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you. Thank the panelists.
I also want to thank Sue, Kathryn, and David. It's just such an honor to have known, this incredible group of experts here and the contribution that they're making to today's event. So thank you, each of you. And we're going to be looking for ways that we can continue to share that information with our membership. So you'll be hearing more about that after we get through the anniversary. And we'll see you back here around 1:30 then. Thank you.